Welcome to Digital Media Research Unplugged, which is from the Plenary as part of the CCI Digital Methods Summer School, which is hosted at QUT Golden Grove by the QUT Digital Media Research Centre. You can follow and contribute to this discussion using the hashtag CCISS60 on Twitter and other platforms of choice. There's also a link to the live Periscope stream of the panel pinned to the top of the DMRC Twitter account, which is at QUTDMRC. So if you wouldn't mind going to that tweet and retweeting it as well, that would be great to alert people who weren't able to make it here tonight that that's where they can follow the video stream. So we're a panel of 5 digital media researchers who've unplugged from our PowerPoint slides and disconnected from our data visualization software, and we've settled in for some improv, I guess, semi-improv session, but we're not here to chill out. We're here to take stock of the state of the art in digital media research and get clear about the most pressing challenges. How much do we as a society really know about the digital media technologies that are entangled with our everyday lives, our politics and democracy, and even our bodies, increasingly? How are we putting the knowledge that we do have to work? And what do we urgently need to know more about? We'll discuss questions like, how is digital media research currently being applied in contexts like health, education, and activism? What are the knowledge gaps and challenges there? What's the quality of the evidence for the policy and legal decisions being made on our behalf? For example, on questions of piracy, on questions of digital inclusion, and online social behaviour and safety. How can we build a better national and international evidence base for this? And just how much do digital media and tech companies actually know about us? Are all those smart devices and data analytics leading to a permanent state of ubiquitous surveillance? Are they providing new forms of consumer empowerment, convenience, and transparency? Do they even know as much about us as they think they do? So my name is Burgess, and I'm a professor of digital media and the director of the QUT Digital Media Research Centre. My own research focuses on enhancing the public understanding of digital media technologies and helping industry and policy better understand how the public is actually using and experiencing them. My methods range from using big data to map public communication around controversial issues, through to user experience walkthroughs of mobile dating apps, as well as understanding how platforms and their cultures of use co-evolve over time. And this has ranged from looking at YouTube when it was new to Twitter and the iPhone, and I've written and co-edited some books on those topics. Joining me are 4 colleagues who are all leading experts in digital media and communication. In alphabetical order, Kath Albury, at Kath Albury on Twitter.
Not tweeting right now.
But you can tweet about her and mention her awesomeness. Focus. Is an associate professor in the School of the Arts and Media at the University of New South Wales. Her current research focuses on young people's practices of digital self-representation and the role of user-generated media, including social networking platforms in young people's formal and informal sexual learning. She's worked with a range of government and non-government orgs, including the National Rugby League, New South Wales Health Department, AIDS Council New South Wales, Family Planning New South Wales and Queensland, and Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia. Kath is also a co-author of the Selfie course, a Creative Commons syllabus for learning and teaching with selfies, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. Axel Bruns, in the burnt orange shirt, is a professor in the Digital Media Research Centre and was a chief investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence of Creative Industries Innovation. He's also the vice president and future president of the Association of Internet Researchers, the author of blogs, Wikipedia Second Life and Beyond, From Production to Producage, Gatewatching, Collaborative Online News Production, and a co-editor of Twitter and Society, Companion to New Media Dynamics and Uses of Blogs. Eszter Hargittai, in the pink shirt, is, that's at Eszter with a Z. Eszter, what it is with it. Okay. Eszter Hargittai is a professor in communication studies at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on the social and policy implications of information technologies, with a particular interest in how IT may contribute to or alleviate social inequality. Her research projects have looked at differences in people's web use skills, the evolution of search engines, the organisation and presentation of online content, political uses of information technologies, and how IT are influencing the types of cultural products people consume. Julian Thomas is Director of the Swinburne Institute for Social Research, partner in the CCI, as is UNSW, and also Professor of Media and Communications at Swinburne University of Technology. Julian is Chair of the Management Committee of the website Australian Policy Online, a member of the Consumer Consultative Forum of the Australian Media and Communications Authority, the Telstra CEO's Consumer Forum, and the ARC College of Experts. So please welcome our panel. So we decided it would be good to just begin with some broad questions around the focus and purpose of your digital media research. So basically, what do you do and why and how? So let's start with you, Kath.
So I most recently, as you mentioned in the intro, have been working around the kind of popular anxieties. And I'm not saying that to dismiss them, but you know the kind of growing concern that there is around the ways that young people use social media and their practices as it relates to body sexuality, sexual expression. So things like sexting, things like selfies, and the first stage of that involved talking with young people about the kinds of educational material that they were receiving and how they felt about that and how the laws around sexting impacted on them and what they knew about it. From what I learned in that project and a couple of other projects, I've moved on now to working more with the workforce that's most concerned with the ways that young people deal with media, so sexuality educators, health promotion, juvenile justice. Lots of people in those fields have no pre-service training in terms of media production whatsoever, very little in human sexuality actually, a lot of people who teach sex ed in high school, and feel like they kind of scramble to keep up and are very concerned because they didn't have mobiles when they were young and so they don't know what young people are doing. So the methods that I've used are, you know, some are kind of classic qualitative methods with interviews and focus groups, but I'm moving now more to encouraging people to use the technologies themselves and to use them to kind of, I guess, gain some empathy and some understanding of the ways young people use mobiles and social media platforms and why, but also just to kind of get a feel for the technologies and look at the ways that the things that young people nowadays are doing are actually in many ways not that different to a whole spectrum of other kinds of relationship practices or social practices. So that's the in a nutshell version.
Thank you. Axel, I'll come to you next. You can sum up your many and varied research programs.
Yeah, look, I mean, for me, my interest has always been in a nexus between what I call news, journalism, public debate overall, and ultimately how people inform themselves, how society informs itself about what's going on in the world. So this is really about the public sphere and the structure of the public sphere as well, particularly, of course, in an environment, in a media environment that keeps constantly changing and has been changing massively over just the last few decades that I've been working in this field, with the advent of the internet in the first place, the web, with different types of web technologies, obviously all the news organizations going online, blogs, Wikipedia, social media arriving and so on. So the way that we inform ourselves, the way that information flows, the sources that we use have kept changing very, very significantly. And that's ultimately very much changing how and where people are getting information from, what kind of information they're getting, what they do with that information as well, how they themselves are passing it on, how they themselves are also generating information, of course. So it's no longer simply receiving information. It never has been just receiving information from media organizations, but certainly now we are all of us more and more generating information about everything that goes on around us, about our daily lives, but also public events in our lives. So the way that information proposed, the way that society operates ultimately has changed significantly. And that ultimately has some real implications also for democracy itself. Because an informed democracy relies on an informed citizenry. That's a very well-established tenet of democracy itself. And if the citizenry informs itself in a different way, then that changes ultimately how democracy works as well.
And how your methods of research changed over that time from the blogs work through to now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously one big change has been that we've seen a shift in platforms and a shift in what data or information these platforms provide and generate, and what data can be accessed by us as researchers as well. So we are talking about big data, we're talking about big social data from social media platforms, for example. That's a very interesting source on a very large number of people doing things with information online in various ways, and has been a really important, really interesting source of work, of material that we can use and that we also need new methods for, because we're now dealing with millions of tweets, tens of millions of Facebook updates, all these hundreds of millions of pages on the web, and so accessing that, processing that, making sense of all of that requires different methods. But at the same time, of course, we also continue to use some very well-established methods that look very closely at how news is produced, for example, in newsrooms, how individuals are engaging with the media around, and that requires some very close engagement with these individuals, interviews, ethnographic work, surveys, and everything else.
Thank you. And Eszter, I gave a very quick summary from the material in your bio.
Yeah, actually, but I think we skipped my institutional affiliation. So I think I'll mention that. No, that's okay, just so people have context. So I'm a professor at Northwestern University, which is in the Chicago area in the US, and a lot of my research has to do with the US, but I follow international research, and actually in my area, which I'll tell you about in a sec, a lot of the findings do parallel research on the topic in Australia. So I'm interested in lots of things, but especially focused on what we call digital inequality. And the idea of digital inequality is that even after people go online, there will be differences among them as to how they are using digital media in their lives, and in particular, how they might benefit from their use of digital media. And that's really the big question that drives my work. Who benefits, and how can we make sure that different segments of the population benefit? That it's not just the privileged who get even more privilege just because they're using digital media. And within this set of questions, I'm especially interested in people's skills, so being able to use the internet effectively and efficiently. And in the beginning, I researched this topic focusing especially on information seeking, and there the methods I used were really hands-on, where I'd meet in person, one-on-one with people, ask them to look for things and look at how they did. So this was a mix of qualitative and quantitative work. A lot of my other research is actually survey-based, so pretty traditional, and because I'm studying differences in internet users, I don't think it's appropriate to sample people online or to survey them online, and so this is actually, it raises all sorts of challenges in this day and age, because who takes a survey not online anymore? So I need to get people to do that. And so later I'm happy to get into details about the challenges that poses. But one of my arguments when it comes to methods, and even with respect to digital research, is that we have a lot to learn and take with us from more traditional methods, and we don't want to abandon everything that many decades of social science figured out before us.
Thank you, that's a really important point there. And Julian, digital inclusion relates to some of your work.
Well, yeah, very much connected to my interests, Jean. I'm somebody who's worked for a while, really on probably a varied set of problems, but I suppose my core interests are around new communications technologies and their pasts and futures, and their social distribution, their uptake. I'm interested very much in understanding the distribution of the benefits of new media, of digital media, and public computer networks, and how we can make those benefits available to more people. So a lot of my work has been around that, with colleagues at the now interested in sort of scaling that research up, if I can, to work out ways to engage some of these large issues like digital inclusion or digital equality or inequality at a sort of national level in a way that's still useful for local researchers. I'm interested in the benefits of digital media. I'm also really interested in what's wrong with it, what doesn't work well, and how we can fix it or do something about it. And for that reason, I've also had a long-standing interest in the sort of legal, regulatory policy issues around digital media and digital media industries. So this is another focus.
Well, just following on that, along those lines for you and perhaps for everyone, you know, what are some of the more specific, concrete examples of problems that your research is addressing as real-world projects?
Sure.
In a real sense.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this probably relates quite directly to the sorts of things we've already been talking about, but it is remarkable at this point, you know, we still have a very substantial number of Australians who are not online in any way and are not enjoying the benefits of the digital media that we take for granted a lot of the time. So, you know, 20% of Australians are still are digitally excluded. And that number isn't really changing fast. So we've had a lot of kind of fairly complacent assumptions at the policy level about, you know, the internet, digital media, these things becoming what we call 100% technologies, as the telephone did eventually. It's not quite happening. So why isn't it happening? What can we do about that? And so this is, I think, a very challenging topic for us to think about.
Maybe I'll follow up to this.
Sure.
Digital inclusion thread is pretty similar to some of my work. So we know more and more about what correlates with what in terms of, you know, that we do in fact know that more privileged people are doing more things that they can benefit from online, and that they tend to be more skilled. But what we still don't quite have enough information about is real life outcomes of being online. And when I say real life outcomes, I mean fairly major outcomes such as academic performance, ability to get a good job or get a job quicker, better health, more informed political participation. So we need data, better data, to be able to answer questions like that, and that usually means we need data over time about the same people. And for those of you who do social science research, which I suspect is many of you in this room, know that that's a really complicated and very expensive proposition. And so that's something that's, I think, a challenge for the field, and some of us are working on getting more data, but that's going to require definitely more work. And just one more related point, so there's this idea of digital natives, so the supposedly savvy, born with digital youth. And some of my work and work by others, including some Australian researchers, has shown that that's very much a myth, that just because you're young doesn't mean that you're automatically savvy. And one of the things that this research shows is that, in fact, if you're from a higher socioeconomic status family, then you're probably going to be more skilled, as even if you're young and have been born digital. So that's just something really important to keep in mind, because we need to make sure that we're not assuming too much as children are entering the school system, that we're actually making available opportunities for them to learn about digital technologies rather than assuming that they're coming in knowing everything about them.
So Kath, that might be a good opening for you to talk about some of the real problems that your research is.
Yes, some of the links from what Eszter just said to my research, it relates to ways that spending decisions are made regarding curriculum policy or health promotion policy, and what gets resourced, what doesn't get resourced. One of the things that I've seen in my research with adults is that there's a lot of material being generated all the time in Australia and probably in other places, which calls itself media literacy education, which is supposed to combat young people's, you know, inappropriate consumption of pornography or overshares online or different things like that, which actually, you know, might deal with literacy in terms of, you know, how do we interpret this Rihanna video, so kind of reading literacy, but doesn't actually address the other side of literacy, which we address in schools of English and those kinds of things, which is production. And where I think there's...
How do you make a reality?
How do you make a reality video? Yeah. What do people do with media? Not just what does media do to us, but what do we do with media? And the way a lot of so-called literacy education is being run, I think in Australia, is not actually promoting literacy. It's in a kind of sneaky or underhand way promoting abstinence. And I know from anyone who's
you mean abstinence, not sexual abstinence?
No, but abstinence from media practice or making media or even consuming certain kinds of media. And if you talk to people in health promotion or if you've looked at the literature in sexuality education, there's nowhere in the world in sexuality education that abstinence has come out on top in terms of educational strategy. And I'm not sure why we think that's a good idea in terms of a media literacy strategy, and yet it feels right to a lot of people. And one of the things that my work is trying to do is to not just critique the existing frameworks, but actually kind of constructively build evidence to talk about how this work could be done differently. And policymakers and educators and health workers can actually engage with those literacies and work with them too. Yeah.
Tell us just a little bit more about how you're actually doing that in some of the recent...
Yeah, so most recently in the last year I did some work with True Relationships, which used to be Family Planning Queensland, but they got a funky rebrand last year, and Family Planning New South Wales. And we did workshops where I'm often invited to tell people about my research, as a kind of in-service resourcing project. And I offered, instead of doing that, why don't I tell you a little bit about some of the theoretical frameworks that I use to think about new things, because I didn't grow up with a mobile phone either. I'm 48, so it's not like this is natural to me. I have to process this stuff too. So here are some theories I use, and that was the first half, which people kind of nodded off. But in the second half, we got our phones out and made different kinds of selfies and talked about taking selfies and how it felt to take different kinds of pictures and what it meant in terms of our expression of identity. And for many of those people, we did a brief evaluation afterwards, but many of the people, longer term, when we said, what did you talk about after the workshop or what was most useful, it was the selfie work that was most useful for them, because they worked in organisations often where phones were this kind of contamination or distraction in the workplace, and you didn't want the young people dealing with the stuff they already do. So the notion of that the educators first could find out why you need to take 10 selfies, which is often because the first night you looked crap, but also what you can do with selfies in terms of thinking through the kinds of things that educators want to talk about with young people. It was a really kind of valuable experience for them, but it took the hands-on aspect of it, I think, for people to see what the value of this would be.
Fantastic, thank you. And Axel, I guess practice is a key area where problems arise that our research on social media crisis, for example.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, talk about changing mindsets, for example. We've seen this, we've documented that, and I think that's actually made a real impact as well. We have documented, for example, during the floods that we've had here in Brisbane in 2011, how social media were actually being used. And very clearly at that point, for the first time, certainly in Brisbane, in Queensland, and maybe in Australia, social media really played an important role in a major natural disaster. And we were able to document that through the research work, the analytical work that we've been able to do. Now that's a real game changer in a sense, and we've really been able to document that, because again, before then there was that sort of mindset also amongst the emergency service organizations that mobile phones are a problem. They're something to kind of just, or social media are a problem, and that they're distracting, they're spreading misinformation, all these sorts of things. And ultimately, police, for example, were always just putting out messages warning kids not to use social media, all these sorts of things. And then suddenly during the crisis, we suddenly see the police themselves actually using social media very, very effectively, very productively to inform the public about what's going on from minute to minute, to really live tweet from the crisis meetings that the Premier's involved in and so on. And in a sense, that really changes public understanding of social media, changes it from something that is sort of a threat and something unknown and something that the kids are on and no one understands what they're doing, which was never true in Australia in the first place, but that was the public perception, to something that is actually really playing a major role as a source of information during an event like that, as an additional source of information, not replacing radio and TV and so on, but actually working alongside it. So our work's been able to document that, to document also where it slots into the overall media sphere. For example, that becomes an obvious back channel to local radio. So local radio publishes, broadcasts out information. People respond to that via social media to add to it, to give accurate updates back to the radio station, and then they broadcast it out. So you finally have a feedback loop much more than you had before. So the work that we've been doing through that has documented that, but in fact, in documenting that, it's also really provided an additional ammunition for emergency management organizations themselves, for their media units in particular, to try and tell people, and to try and tell the people who fund them, well, we actually need to invest in this because, look here, it actually turns out to be quite important. And we can't just ignore this anymore. We've got to do something about it. We've got to build resources around it, policy around it. We've got to staff, build up our staff around it as well. Ultimately, my sense of this is always there's a lot of investment, and that's perfectly fine in frontline staff who run into burning buildings and pull people out. There isn't enough investment still in the people who may not be doing that, but who are posting out information through all the media channels that are available to actually keep people from being in danger in the first place, to keep them from driving into flood areas, to keep them from driving into fire zones and so on. So that media function of emergency management is just as important and potentially saves a greater number of lives by keeping them unaffected in the first place. And it's just not being resourced.
So that project is a great example of how our research can inform industry, working in partnership. And I should say, this is an Australian Research Council funded linkage grant, so we're really grateful for that funding.
In collaboration with
the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, and we've been fortunate to have a PhD student, Emma Potter, who I don't know if she's here, but Emma Potter's being embedded with the organisation. So that's been a really important way to get that engagement and the take-up. But as I hinted at the beginning, there's far more to the industry picture here, and things are changing rapidly in terms of the amount of data that's available, the data markets, the data analytics that are fundamentally part of industry practice, whether you're talking about the media industry or the tech industries themselves, the social media platform companies themselves. So they're doing a lot of research in-house these days as well, hiring social scientists and even philosophy grads. So are we just playing around on the outside, and is the real knowledge being generated on the inside, or is there an opportunity for us there? Maybe Eszter, you want to start off on this?
Sure.
Seven questions.
And maybe this is a good time to disclose that I have received funding from Facebook and from Google and from Merck Pharmaceuticals and also from private foundations. And anyway, but I feel like it's diverse enough that hopefully it's clear that it's not affecting my perspective.
It all comes out in the wash.
That's what I figure. But as Jean mentioned, these companies are hiring more and more well-trained social scientists, which is exciting. So my very recent PhD student, Eden Litt, just started at Facebook this past year. So I think it's exciting that they have very smart social scientists working there. What we don't really know as outsiders is how their academic type of research is supported from within, right? So we don't know if they really get the resources and the go-ahead on doing very rigorous, careful work. We see some of their work come out, some of it they publish, but presumably a lot of it they don't. So it's very hard for us to know what they're actually doing. And one point that's come up in some conversations, and I think needs to come up more and more, is that what does it mean that private industry holds proprietary access to some of the most exciting data sets out there? And what does it mean that they're starting to win all the awards at certain conferences, academic conferences, because in fact they have much more exciting data that they can work with? So I'm just putting that out there. I don't have the answers, but I do think it's something we need to think about at least. I do want to make another point, though, contradicting a little bit well, that doesn't contradict it. So they have exciting data, but I also think it's very important to be critical of the data that they have. And I think some of them are increasingly aware of this because some of us keep pushing back when they do publish work. But as I noted, my interest is in digital inequality, and so I'm very focused on the fact that people use different digital media at different rates, and some people don't use many of the services ever. And so any one proprietary service is only going to have data about their users, and they are going to have more data about their more active users. And so one thing they have to be careful about is to what extent can they really generalize? Usually the answer is not much, from the data that they're analyzing from what users are generating on their sites. In social science, there's this, one of the big mantras is, avoid sampling on the dependent variable, which basically means don't select cases based on your variables of interest. And in a lot of situations when we're getting data from platforms, that's exactly what's happening. So when Facebook does a study, and sorry to pick on them, but when they do a study that looks at political engagement on Facebook, and one of the variables they use to pick people who get into the study in the first place are people who've actually signaled their political ideology on Facebook, that's a problem, because if you've already told Facebook your political ideology, that's probably because you actually care about politics. And so already we have a study about people who care about politics, but that's not how they actually then tell us about the study. So that's just something, I'm putting this out there partly for people to be really careful reading studies that are done by these companies on their own data. That next time you see a press release that's all exciting about what their 2 million, 2 billion, whatever observations found, to keep that in mind as you interpret their findings, just to be critical as you.
And to add to that, the studies that get published are in some ways the byproduct of a completely separate process that is far from disinterested, which is seeking to understand to what extent would me sharing my objectionable political opinion with Julian make Julian not come to Facebook anymore. And so if you think about, for example, research into democracy and deliberation and agonistic publics, for example, you might want to work precisely against that. You might want to figure out how to get people to encounter different views. So I think that's a really important piece of this puzzle as well. The infamous so-called, wrongly called Facebook mood manipulation study was really about how to keep people cheerful and on Facebook all the time. So keep that downer stuff about those war places and stuff like that up out of my feed. And maybe, Axel, I can throw to you on this question of industry research, not only industry research, but industry data, maybe some stuff about how data analytics are playing a role in the media themselves and the news industries as well.
Absolutely, and I think, just even to follow on from that too, the other thing is most of the studies that Facebook or Twitter will publish will be studies that tell something positive about them as well. So Twitter is not going to publish a study that says we are bleeding users, or here's how much abuse there is on the platform or whatever. So none of that, they may do that internally. Perhaps there might be very good research internally, but we're not going to hear anything about it. So obviously everything that they publish is ultimately also designed to keep investors happy and engaged and so on. And that's also a really big, a factor of bias, I guess, in what gets out. So that's also a really important aspect of this. But more broadly, yes, there is a real problem that most of us as publicly funded researchers particularly actually don't have a great deal of access to the large-scale data sets that are available internally, because in the end we end up researching much more around the edges than the companies themselves can do. At the same time, there are also commercial research institutions, the Nielsen's of this world and so on, who are often in partnership also with these major social media companies and do have access and can afford buying access if necessary, of course. But very often, again, a lot of the work that they're doing is relatively shallow, is relatively commercially oriented towards their own clients, and not necessarily provides a huge deal of depth in the research that's being done. There is also, again, the problem, as you're saying, that individual companies might have individual data but can't put it all together. So, for example, when we're looking at the news industry, we're looking at engagement across the news industry with their websites and with their social media accounts and so on. They all have their own individual metrics that they're tracking, but they're not necessarily actually putting all of that together because none of them will share all the data with each other. So they know, individually, they know little. If they put it all together, we know a lot, but no one's actually able to do that, basically. And so we've got to find other ways that work against that, and try and extract as much information as we can from the sources that are available to us, that are publicly available to us, or buy data access that we can afford it, which we usually can't, to really develop these much more comprehensive views. And from that also develop much more comprehensive ways of looking at these practices overall that you simply can't do if all you have is your own internal data.
Well, just a couple of points. I think to add to those very illuminating remarks on the information resources available right now for researchers in digital media. On the one hand, they're unbelievably vast. You know, I do not have students saying there is a shortage of information. And in so many ways, I compare our position with those of media researchers in the analog age who knew far less about the industries they were looking at than we do now. That is a remarkable state of affairs. There's also, I think, a really interesting moment now with this question of what sort of data is publicly produced, is publicly available for researchers in universities and elsewhere who are not tied to a particular industry or corporate agenda. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics has just reviewed the way in which they collect data about how Australia's households use information technology, what IT they use, what they do with it, how often they collect it, what sorts of questions they should be asking. So we're waiting to see how the ABS is going to do this in the future, but that is a very important set of questions, I think, for all of us as researchers who are going to rely on that sort of publicly funded and publicly available information. I think that I totally understand the critique of the industry data. I think we've got to be a little bit careful about quickly dismissing it. Companies like Nielsen's and Roy Morgan and others do very substantial social research, and if we understand what they are doing, that's the critical question, and how they have done it, their data can be useful, and it is possible to work in partnership with them or with companies that may be, or other organisations that may be interested in buying their data. The other issue for us is that at the moment, and for a long time, our big challenge has been developing good longitudinal data sources in this space. So we can see what happens over time. And most of our research funding agencies are not interested in funding this kind of data. So when we look at how this challenge has been met, say in the area of, with our social research colleagues who are interested in the dynamics of households, that work has to be funded directly by the major government agencies that are involved in that. In our space, it's an exciting time because our current Prime Minister, when he was Minister for Communications, set up a Bureau for Communications Research, which reorganised the way government collects data in the space and will reorganise what is publicly available. So I think, there could be some very positive things coming, at least at a reasonably aggregate level, not about particular platforms. But this could change for us.
And even at the platform level, we've seen, it's nascent at the moment, but we can probably all help to amplify a little bit the rise of things like the concept of data philanthropy, right, where it's part of kind of corporate citizenship on behalf of platforms like Twitter or Facebook or Google to actually make useful data available to researchers, to non-profits. Crisis communication is a great application domain for data philanthropy, for example.
Can I just follow up on this? So yeah. I don't disagree that there's a lot of potential. I think there are a lot of things to tweak in how things are working right now for that potential to be met with these big data. And I do want to say though so I want to caution against the hypnotic effect of millions of records, and that research design still very much matters, and sampling remains an incredibly important factor, and I think it's too easy to forget that when we have millions of records and people think, oh, it's so many data points, it must be all representative of something. And it may be of something, but probably unrelated to the research question. So I have a paper out called Is Bigger Always Better that was published last year, and in that I show that no, it's not always the size that matters, and so I just recommend that, taking a look at that if you're interested in these questions, where I use some data sets using traditional methods, survey research on phones and on paper, showing the biases of who actually uses these platforms in the first place, which then shows that what data we're getting off of the platforms will be biased depending, again, on what questions you're asking. I'd like people to keep that in mind, because I think hearing 5 billion records just makes people think, wow, that is quite the study, and maybe it's not.
You're right, someone has to say that.
Well, don't we have to ask the same critical questions we ask of any other?
And we do need to ask that, and we don't tend to because we're wowed by the, not me, but many people are wowed by the size of the data set.
So, just shifting gear a little bit, and going back to the question about what use are we to anyone, which is always, I'm trying to wake up every morning and think about what use are to somebody. But to put it negatively, what sort of dumb decisions are we going to make as a society if we don't get better evidence on some of these questions? To put it more positively, I suppose, what sort of positive changes have we already made, we've already seen occur in policy and practice with our research? So, Kath, you've been quiet for a while, I might. And it's such a good impact case study that.
Well, the sexting study that we did in 2013 was picked up by the Victorian Law Reform Inquiry, and some of the legal reforms in Victoria came from our recommendations, and we know that. I know that the Board of Studies for Health and Physical Education in New South Wales is recommending the selfie exercises now to teachers after they invited me to give a presentation on that. So there are spaces where some of our research, just as our research kind of, I think, has direct impact in policy and practice. I think in the question of what is the problem, what are the problems if the evidence isn't taken account of, I think people can spend a lot of money on really well-meaning things that don't work, don't engage the people they're trying to engage. There's a lot of people in health and education over the past few years who are very besotted with the idea of apps, because the kids sit down with the apps and the kids love the apps, and apps are a good thing and a useful thing, but they can be in the sphere of health or education, they can become a kind of not very useful walled garden where not everyone wants to hang out and play, and the app might be on your phone, but it doesn't mean you're using it, whereas people are very active in another space, and the same money that went to the app developers could have gone to an outreach worker to go and chat, on a social media platform where people were already talking about sex or music or whatever they were talking about. So there's sometimes, I think, a push to spend money in, the innovative space that isn't really based on evidence about what people's ordinary practices are, or where they're already comfortable, or where they're already talking about particular things that government agencies would like to, intervene in. And I think that the kinds of research that we do in different ways can be very useful in assisting the people who are trying to allocate budget and get the best value for their budget. So think about how they spend it.
Julian, I think some of your work with the remote broadband project would be another good example here.
Well, I think, yes, that's an example of a project which has made a bit of a difference. In a small way, I think an example of the kinds of things we're talking about with, and I'm talking about some work that I've done particularly with colleagues at Swinburne, Ellie Rennie in particular, and some organisations in Central Australia, the Central Land Council, and a wonderful research and development organisation, a small one in Alice Springs called the Centre for Appropriate Technologies. And what we did there was really at a community level look at why the Indigenous communities were not making better use of the opportunities presented by the availability of broadband internet in those very remote places where, on the face of it, you'd say the benefits of those technologies would be greater than for almost anyone else in the country. The challenges of the distances involved. And one of the things we found was that the terms of service, the rules that were set by our national broadband network providing the internet service for retailers in those communities really precluded those retailers from selling a service which met the needs of that market. It was virtually impossible for them to set up, say, for example, a community Wi-Fi network, which was really something which people themselves wanted as a way of managing the internet themselves in this community. So, as a result of that research, they have challenged those things, and there's been a very productive debate, a policy debate in the last 6 months about also how we can change the way we fund the universal service obligation and some of these core telecoms regulations which really go to internet accessibility and affordability in this country. That work has made a difference. You mentioned another scenario, which is what sort of dumb decisions would arise if, just say, we had policy making that was not based on evidence. And I'm not having a lot of trouble. But I could say copyright. One example.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that my work helps libraries keep getting funded. I don't know the situation in Australia that well on this point, and just as a complete amateur observer, I get the impression that Australia does better with support of cultural institutions and educational institutions than the US. That said, I wouldn't be surprised if libraries are kind of on the chopping block here as well, potentially, because of these assumptions that, well, we have Google, why do we need anything else for finding information? And so I'm hoping that my research on skill differences and specifically focusing on how young people in particular can differ considerably in their abilities to find information well, and especially in their assessment of the credibility of information, will help libraries and librarians make a case for why they, as educators and libraries as institutions, are still critical to a functioning society.
I think it's fair to say that in Australia we have, libraries have gotten on the front foot actually quite well in thinking about themselves, thinking quite laterally about their role in terms of connecting people to knowledge, connecting people to each other, and the digital inclusion agenda. They were happy all over. So I think we've got a lot to be proud of.
That's wonderful.
But I think the next phase of digital media technologies is probably posing a little more of a challenge, and the challenge of keeping physical collections and all that. But yeah.
Well, the challenge of making e-books available to the communities who...
Great example. How do you lend an e-book?
How do you lend an e-book? It turns out you can't lend an e-book in the way you can lend a physical book. The legal protections for doing so don't exist. So libraries are now having to work out what this new environment will involve, and they do need some research to help them understand.
Part of that is just being locked into old paradigms. That's the way we've always done it, so that's the way we're going to continue to do it. In the case of the library, the whole idea of checking out a thing, to take home and do something with, for example. I think, and I agree with you on the sort of the evidence-based thing. In Australia, we've had this idea of evidence-based policy making at least since the Capital 70s, and I don't think it still hasn't arrived. That's not needed. So, we still have a lot of policy by gut feel that's being done in government organizations as much as in industry. And I think it's really important to break through that. And I know for a fact that some of the work that we've done around crisis communication, for example, the evidence that we've been able to provide on how social media were used during points of flashback, I know for a fact because police have told me that it has enabled them to make a strong argument internally to move this from something they didn't have as the crisis was happening to an ongoing core function of their media unit. I know for a fact that the same research that we've done was instrumental in getting the Bureau of Meteorology on Twitter, because the folks at Twitter Australia actually showed them the work that we've done, and that helped convince them that maybe they should be on Twitter, because that's actually where people are. And this is again the problem, that a lot of this stuff still, a lot of the government response is still, let's build a site so people can go there and find out, rather than saying, let's go where people actually are, where they naturally hang out, and maybe we inform them there, rather than building some place that they need to come to, maybe register, get access first, or whatever else.
Rather than building an emergency for you app.
Yes, exactly.
Which,
exactly.
yeah, is not
but that's
the only
still, yeah, but that is still a
Yeah.
fundamental sort of, and it's not just government, it's industry just as badly. All of them want to build their own little walled gardens where no one ever goes, because then at least they control the walled garden. And often it's actually the KPI is not so much that anyone uses it; it's just that they developed it. The development project has been completed, has been acquitted. It's there, and if no one uses it, well, it must be the fault of people. And that's ultimately, I mean, without saying anything particularly bad about emergency management, but there, particularly in government hubs overall, there is sort of a sense that you've got to change the way that the community acts in order to help them. And that's just never going to happen. The community doesn't change. You change what you do to reach the community. You know, other than a very small number of exceptions. You know, maybe getting people to stop smoking, but that's taken 20 years or so to actually do that. And you know, if you want quicker change, you've actually got to go where they are rather than hope that they come to you. A lot of people still don't get it.
I think there's a very strong thread here speaking against the deficit model in media literacy, or the deficit model in community engagement with information, and the very strong need for really well-grounded user and consumer research. So I guess the final step we need to make is, well, what's coming next? So we're not futurologists, but I think there are some, I think it's obvious that there are some things changing in the digital media environment right now, and that we shouldn't be too relaxed about our approaches, our methods, or even the basic concepts that underwrite the research that we do. We could think about, well, you know, the buzzwords of the automation and algorithm curation and all of that. I think that's well known, and it's quite well understood, some of the transformations that's having. But what happens if it's true, as was somebody wrote a piece in the conversation, the name slipped my mind, I'm really sorry, yesterday or today, based on some Pew research data suggesting, and as is often the case, the students in my classroom, if it's not the students in your classroom, it's usually my teenage children, all migrating off public social media, quasi-public social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and increasingly participating in ephemeral and private mobile and instant messaging. So if that were true, how would that change the work that you do, Axel, or the work that you do, Eszter, about
well, since you brought up that piece, so I had a lot of problems with that piece because it does start out with my students, and I don't think this person actually has done any research on this herself. And Pew Research Center does really fantastic data collection, survey-based about Americans' internet uses, and lots of people reference it because we don't have that many other nationally representative data to reference in the US. So this piece references Pew data to make her points, but it would be an excellent piece to read in a class on how to tell any story you want with the same data set. The author picks data points like how, look, only 30% of 18 to 29-year-olds use Twitter. That's true and has been for a long time. There have never been more than 30% of 18 to 29 years who use Twitter. Now, she uses this as evidence that Twitter's in decline, but again, that's the highest penetration Twitter's ever seen in that age group.
So there's something missing in that sentence, in the US.
In the US, yes, but I don't think it's actually higher in any other country for that age group. I'm pretty sure, unless you have data. But the point is that she uses the evidence out of context, let's put it that way. And also, even from that table that you can look at on Pew's site, you can see that Twitter is still most popular with that age group. So again, not really helpful for her argument that young people are disappearing from these platforms. She may be talking about even younger people who doesn't have data on younger people than adults 18 and over, and she doesn't point to any data sets on younger people. So I don't think there's any evidence for the claim she's making other than her students, which is completely anecdotal. You're right, the other version is my kids, which is pretty common. But as academics, I mean, it's one thing for certain people to have that conversation, but as an academic, I think we need to have more rigorous evidence to base a piece on. So I'm just going to leave it at that and not even take on the issue of is that trend happening, because I don't know. It may be if people are noticing it, but I'd like to see some evidence before I actually take it on. Sure. Conversation. But it feels,
what is true? Axel.
Yeah.
So I think some things that we are seeing, I think, patterns in the data that we're collecting, that there is an increasing use of visual objects as visual communication. So how might that ask us to invent new methods or challenge some of the work?
But just to clarify, that's a different point from what that woman made. And I conceive evidence of that, and I'd love to hear what it is.
That's fine.
I mean, maybe just one thing just to pick up on what you said, the question about the Pew research is always also that it's being used indiscriminately around the world, even though it only shows US trends. But the amount of times when Pew puts something out and the next day I get a call from journalists saying, Pew says Twitter is in decline with this age group, so are Australian teens leaving them, or whatever, you know. I mean, I'm waiting for someone to finally work out, okay, Pew also keeps saying that Twitter is really, really big with African-American adolescents. I'm waiting for the Australian journalist who calls me up and says, what about Australian African-American adolescents? Are they also big on Twitter?
Okay, let's move from
anyway, so I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. There are obviously constantly changes in how people are using the mix of media technologies that they've got available, the mix of social media platforms that they've got available to them. There are constantly new platforms emerging. We're being on Periscope right now. Hello. So those sorts of platforms emerge and define again potentially. Others come along and so on. So one thing is obviously we need to constantly be wary of locking ourselves just into the one medium. Just also because, let's say, the data is easily accessible from that more than others. So that's a constant challenge, trying to work out what we can do with any of these platforms, with the studies of any of these platforms, that goes beyond just studying these platforms themselves. But also practices on these platforms themselves keep changing constantly. I mean, Twitter users are famous for having invented most of the features of Twitter while the platform was already running, the hashtag, the attention, and many other things. And of course, short links, embedded photos, embedded videos, and so on. And there is, I think you're right, there is a gradual sort of movement towards more and more audio-visual content, particularly visual content, particularly photos and GIFs and so on. Twitter stream is going to go off because I said GIF rather than GIF, apparently that's still an issue.
It is GIF.
I know that.
That's that.
So there is that shift, and obviously it means that if we wanted to deal with that quantitatively, we've got to find ways to actually deal with this mass of images quantitatively, to do automated image analysis, whatever it might be. And there are some ways that can do that. There are some models that extract text, for example, from those when there is text in, or try and recognize whether it's a person or a landscape or whatever else. But there are also some very severe limits to how far that can go and what it can do. There are some studies that say you look at what's the overarching color of the image, and maybe that's useful, but I think that also has a very clear limit to how useful it is.
And there's a massive gap between what is possible and automated
and what's
image
available
analysis and what might be considered robust methodology in visual communication, visual studies, for example.
Yes, we need to actually bring in those theories.
But these are minor issues.
Right.
Compared to, for example, what if the web is increasingly a minor part of the infrastructure that powers our communication ecosystem, if you want to use that metaphor, the appification of everything, the Facebookification of everything that can't be appified by another. But what about like the kind of underlying technologies that organise even that. So, I mean, Julian, I know you're very interested in emerging technologies and cultures around things like blockchain technology and so on.
We've had some really interesting discussions.
Yeah.
This week during summer school, Jean, about some of these things. I think they're very interesting for researchers, and one of the reasons why is that I think that what we can do as people working in often in universities and outside these large internet companies we've been talking about is we can participate in the development of alternative kinds of digital media, and blockchain is a great example of a sort of relatively highly prospective and open-ended sort of emerging platform which seems to suggest all sorts of alternative possibilities and different ways of thinking about what we've imagined the internet's always been. So, we've been talking this week about how that might relate to some of these long-standing, intractable problems around things like intellectual property, problems with privacy and those sorts of things. I think that's great. But if we are looking forward in the way you're suggesting we should, I think we should be assuming that the next period of transformation in digital media is likely to be just as disruptive, just as transformative as the last 20 years. And we should be looking at what is going to disrupt the disruptors. At the moment, we have a generation of extremely powerful siloed platforms. We have a winner-take-most syndrome across digital media. We're talking about the same companies all the time. But what if that isn't necessarily the case, and what is going to perhaps disrupt those disruptors? And it may well be emerging platforms like blockchain. But what's exciting from a research perspective, I think, is the opportunity to engage just as our predecessors in digital media have been doing for many years in Australia, in North America and elsewhere, to help invent new kinds of networks, whether they're community networks in remote parts of the world or new kind of software solutions for communication or media distribution.
And just to end with the fields, at a completely different scale, Kath, your work and the work like people like you do, continuing to engage with what is actually going on the ground, how young people, for example, are actually...
Yeah, and one of the things that I actually do, or I try to do in the workshops with the adults particularly, is to reassure them that you don't actually have to be 100% across every single platform in order to do work with people who are using those platforms. And in fact, we all know, rest in peace, MySpace. There were many youth outreach projects that took many years to come to fruition and get through ethics to be launched on MySpace, just as Facebook kind of rolled over the top of it. And so, I would kind of urge a lot of the people that I work with not to be so concerned with an individual platform, but to think more openly about cultures and modes of practice or different kinds of relationships that people pursue in different spaces and how they use technologies as part of those things.
And actually, just on that, I really think it's important for researchers to be thinking that way too, right? So that instead of studying Facebook or Twitter or MySpace and then not getting a job after your dissertation's done, you should study phenomena, right? And where are things happening? And I don't think it's that interesting to know if today's teens are on Facebook or Twitter, but it's more interesting to know what is it that they're actually doing, with whom are they interacting, what's being discussed. So I think the focus should be there rather than the platforms, other than there's specific research questions where the platforms are relevant, but I think the big leading research question should be about those more general.
I think it's a broad church. And inclusive. And I think with that, we're ready to wrap up, actually. We've run out of time for a Q&A because the conversation has been so dynamic, but we've got drinks outside. And mingling. So plenty of opportunity for all of you to talk to each other and talk to us about issues that we raised. And the last thing for me to do is to just thank all of you very much, and please thank Kath.